Good to be back to another class. Welcome to another church history 2 class. And we are going to pick up where we left off the last time. So we are going to be looking at the forerunners of the Reformation. That's where we are going to pick up. Okay, let us pause a prayer. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your goodness and your grace towards us. I pray, Lord, that you take control now. I pray your blessings on the participants and upon myself and the systems that are engaged, Lord, to make this possible. Lead us, Lord, in paths of righteousness. For your name's sake, amen. So the forerunners of the Reformation, the mystics had attempted to personalize religion. And it's not nice that they refer to these people as mystics because they wanted what they had been given by the church leaders was foolishness. Dry and, yes, intellectual, but just dry and, So these persons were saying that they were reaching out and making personal contact with God, reaching out to God for themselves. And many of them had the experience of God reaching out to them in a personal way. They had experiences. So they call them mystics. No, the mystics had attempted to personalize religion. That's what is meant here by. But biblical and nationalistic reformers such as Wycliffe, Huss, and Savonarola were more interested in an attempt to return to the ideal of a church presented in the New Testament. Wycliffe and Huss were able to capitalize on nationalistic anti-papal sentiment during the period of the Babylonian captivity, when the Pope was resident in Avignon. So, John Wycliffe, 1329 to 1384. The English people resented sending money to a Pope in Avignon, who was under pressure from England's enemy, the French king. This nationalistic feeling was augmented or supported by royal and middle-class resentment over the money lost to the English treasury and to the service of the English state by papal taxation. The Statute of Provisors of 1351 banned appointment by the Pope of clergymen to offices in the Roman Church in England. The Statute of Praemunire of 1353 forbade the practice of taking cases concerning clergymen out of English courts for trial in the papal court in Rome. Payment of the annual tribute of 1,000 marks, which had been begun by John, also was stopped by Parliament in this period. It was in this era of nationalistic reaction against ecclesiasticism that Wycliffe appeared on the scene. Aided by the powerful John of Gaunt, Wycliffe was able to defy the Pope. Wycliffe studied and taught at Oxford for the greater part of his life. Until 1378, he wanted to reform the Roman Church by the elimination of immoral clergymen and by stripping it of property which he felt was the root of corruption. In a work entitled Of Civil Dominion, 1376, he asserted a moral basis for ecclesiastical leadership. God gave the use and possession of property, but not the ownership, to church leaders as a trust to be used for His glory. Failure on the part of the ecclesiastics to fulfill their proper functions was a sufficient reason for the civil authority to take the property from them and to give it to someone who would serve God acceptably. This view suited the nobles who were happy to seize the property of the Roman Church. They and John of Gaunt championed Wycliffe so that the Church of Rome did not dare to touch him. I would like you to do a paragraph on Wycliffe in your reflection. Just do a paragraph on who he was, his background, education, and so on. Wycliffe, disgusted with the captivity and schism, was not satisfied with this more negative approach, and after 1379 began to oppose the dogma of the Roman Church with revolutionary ideas. He attacked the authority of the Pope in 1379 by insisting in writing that Christ, and not the Pope, was the head of the Church. He asserted that the Bible, instead of the Church, was his sole authority for the believer, and that the Church should model itself after the pattern of the New Testament. Yes? To support these beliefs, Wycliffe made the Bible available to the people in their own town. By 1382, the first complete manuscript translation into English of the New Testament was finished. Nicholas of Hertford completed the translation. Of most of the Old Testament into English in 1384. Thus, for the first time, Englishmen were able to read the whole Bible in their own tongue. Formerly, it was not so. The Bible was, the Bible wasn't translated into the language of the people. If you were not a scholar, you would not be able to read the Bible, because the Bible was in Greek and Hebrew and Latin. Wycliffe went still further by 1382 in opposing the dogma of transubstantiation, the Roman Catholic belief and doctrine, whereas the Roman Church believed that the substance or essence of the elements changed while the outward form remained the same. Wycliffe argued that the substance of the elements was indestructible, and that Christ was spiritually present in the sacrament and was apprehended by faith. If adopted, Wycliffe's view would mean that the priest could no longer withhold salvation from one by withholding the body and blood of Christ in the communion. Wycliffe's views were condemned in London in 1382, and he was forced to retire to his rectory at Lutterforth. He had made provision for the continued dissemination of his ideas, however, by founding a group of lay preachers, the Lollards, who preached his ideas all over England until the Roman Church, by forcing the Statute of De Oratico Comburendo through Parliament in 1401, made the death penalty the punishment for preaching Lollard ideas. Wow. Wycliffe's accomplishments were influential in paving the way for subsequent Reformation in England. He gave the English their first Bible in the vernacular and created the Lollard Group to proclaim evangelical ideas all over England among the common people. His teachings of equality in the church were applied to economic life by the peasants and contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Bohemian students studying in England carried his ideas to Bohemia, where they became the foundation for the teaching of John Huss. There were still Lollards in England during the early Anglican Reformation. You notice how difficult it is to reform the church? I have had the experience in the Church of United Brethren in Christ, because I didn't just swallow. Because people behave as if the denomination is the same as the church, the universal church, the body of Christ. But they're not. They're not. When Richard II of England married Anne of Bohemia, students from that land came to England to study. When they returned to Bohemia, they carried Wycliffe's ideas back with them. John Huss, part of the Bethlehem Chapel from 1402 to 1414, who had studied in the University of Prague, later taught in it, and had become its rector in about 1409, read and adopted the ideas of Wycliffe. His preaching of these ideas coincided with a rise of Bohemian national feeling against the control of Bohemia by the Holy Roman Empire. Huss proposed to reform the church in Bohemia along lines similar to those proclaimed by Wycliffe. His views exposed him to papal enmity, and he was ordered to go to the Council of Constance under a safe conduct from the emperor. But the safe conduct was not honored. Both his and Wycliffe's views were condemned there. After Huss refused to recant, he was burned at the stake by order of the council. But his book, De Ecclesia, lived on. They started burning people. When you attempt to change some things in the church, if you doubt it, try it. Power and Praise Ministries, as I lead it now, as it is now, is not a denomination. And I believe the revelation of God continues. 90%, if not more, of church leaders don't believe that. So they hold to whatever revelation that brought their group into being. And if you're a part of a group and begin to receive revelation, and you notice that they call a group of reformers mystics, because these people were reforming certain things. They were reaching. As a church shouldn't enslave you. Your religion must not enslave you. It's not a slave master. You should be free to reach out to the Spirit, guided by the Word. Make sure, and I'm not saying that to disregard and overthrow your leaders necessarily, but the leader should not so control you that you are not free to worship God, guided by the Bible. They should be open enough to give that guidance and to accommodate you. So long as your revelation, the base, the source of your revelation is not from Satan and demons, not demonic. So persecutors may destroy men's bodies, but they cannot destroy ideas, and the ideas of Hus were spread by his followers. His more radical followers, known as the Taborites, rejected all in the faith and practice of the Roman Church that could not be found in Scripture. Eutychists took the position that only that which the Bible actually forbade should be eliminated, and that the laity should receive both bread and wine in the Mass. Some of the Taborite group formed what was known as the United Fratrum, or Unitas Fratrum, meaning United Brethren. Unitas Fratrum, and that was our Bohemian Brethren, about 1450. All this took place before the Great Reformation of 1517. The date 1517 is given as the date of the birth of the Reformation, but the wind of change had begun before that. Right, 1450. Unitas Fratrum. It was from this group that the Moravian Church, which still exists, developed later in Germany. The Moravian Church became, at a later date, one of the most missionary-minded churches in the history of Christianity, or in the life of Christianity. John Amos Comenius, the progressive evangelical educator, was one of the brethren. He wrote the great didactic on education. Hus may be said to have indirectly influenced Wesley, because it was the Moravians who helped to lead Wesley to the light in London. The teachings and example of Hus were an inspiration to Luther as he faced similar problems in Germany in his day. 1450. The Moravian movement. The group, the United Brethren in Bohemia, which came into being in 1450. Wycliffe and Hus were branded as heretics who made the Bible the first standard of authority, but Savonarola was more interested in reform within the church. At Florence, becoming a Dominican monk in 1474, he was assigned to Florence in 1490. He tried to reform both state and church in the city, but his preaching against the evil life of the Pope resulted in his death by hanging. He never took the more advanced position that Wycliffe and Hus held, but he did demand reform in the church. All these men anticipated the spirit and work of the reformers, to such an extent that Wycliffe, as the outstanding exponent of Reformation measures, has often been called the morning star of the Reformation. The morning star. Because it was his work in England. These men were educated in the universities and his writings that planted the seed of Reformation in students from Bohemia who went back to Bohemia and continued and spread his views and ideas. Yes, he gave birth to the Unitas Fratrum. Unitas Fratrum, United Brethren. So we're going to look now at the reforming councils. Leaders of the councils of the 14th century sought reform by making church leadership represent the laity. Councils made up of representatives of the people of the Roman Church were to eliminate corrupt church leaders. The council did not emphasize the scriptures to the extent that Huss and Wycliffe did, nor did they seek reform by the subjective religious expression favored by the mystics. The need of reform within the Roman Church became clear with the development of the Great Schism of 1378. In that year, Urban VI and Clement VII each claimed to be the legitimate successor to Peter. Since the countries of Europe had to choose whom they would follow, Europe became split ecclesiastically as well as politically. Both men had been chosen by the College of Cardinals. And yet the conflict developed. Who was to decide their claims? Leading theologians of the University of Paris proposed that a council of the Roman Catholic Church should decide the matter. They used the precedent of the ecumenical councils from 325 to 451. A council representative of all the church seemed to be the best solution because neither pope would abdicate nor accept the decision of arbitrators. Justification for a council's deposing a pope was not wanting. Dante, in his Of Monarchy, written after 1311, insisted that the state as well as the church was an arm of God. Both were given by God. The emperor was to secure man's happiness. Here, the pope to lead them to heaven. Neither was to seek supremacy over the other. Most important of all the rationalizations of conciliar reform was set forth in the book Defensor Pacis by Marsilius of Padua and John of Jandon. In his work, they supported Louis of Bavaria against the Pope. The book destroyed the idea of an absolute hierarchy in either the church or the state. The council was called to end the schism in the leadership of the Roman Church, to reform that church from within, and to put down heresy. It might also put in practice a theory of government along the lines laid down by Marsilius. When the Council of Pisa met in the spring of 1409, Benedict XIII was safely in control of Avignon, and Gregory XI held the papal chair in Rome. The council, which was called by the cardinals, at once stated that the cardinals had the authority to call it, and that it was competent even to call the popes to account for the Great Schism. It deposed both Benedict XIII and Gregory XI and appointed the man who became Alexander V as a rightful pope, but the other two popes refused to recognize the decision of the council. Now there were 3 popes instead of 2. When Alexander V died in 1410, he was succeeded by John XXIII. Church wars. Church wars. But power is sweet. And because power is sweet, once people, a certain person taste power, they don't want to give it up. Power is sweet. It doesn't matter how the means by which they get it. I know what I suffer in the Church of United Brethren in Christ at the hands of Winston Smith, who was bishop, and Lloyd Spencer, who behaved as if he was the founder of the United Brethren Church. And he had served for a very long time and had great influence. The Council of Constance was then called by Sigismund, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And John the 23rd to end the Great Schism, end heresy, and reform the church in head and members. This council was called because of the precedent set by Constance when he called the Council of Nicaea in 325. Over 350 high officials of the hierarchy met. In order to frustrate John's attempt to control the council through the use of a majority vote, which would have permitted his Italian followers to dominate the decisions of the council, the members of the council agreed to vote as national groups of clergymen. Each national group was allotted one vote, and a unanimous vote of the 5 nations represented was necessary for binding action by the council. The council declared its legality and its right to supreme authority in the Roman Church. This decree of the council, which substituted conciliar control of the Church of Rome for papal absolution, was given the title sacrosanct. Presently Gregory XII reigned, and after much negotiation both Benedict XIII and John XXIII were deposed by 1415. Martin V was then elected by the council as the new pope. The council thus took the power of electing a pope from the College of Cardinals. The council also dealt with the problem of heresy by condemning the ideas of Wycliffe and by burning Hus at the stake, in spite of the emperor's promise of safe conduct. It then went on to discuss the problems of reform, schism, and heresy. A decree of the council called frequens provided for the meeting of general councils at stated times in the future as a technique to keep order in the Roman Church. Unrest in Bohemia after the martyrdom of Hus and the need of continued reform brought about the Council of Basel in 1431. The council dragged on until 1449, but in the strength of the reforming movement was matched by a resurgence of papal power. Eugenius IV, the pope at that time, was deposed by the council in 1439, just 1 year after the rival council, which he had called, met at Ferrara. Because of the plague, the rival council was removed to Florence. Plague, not plague, plague. The rival council was moved to Florence in 1439. The Council of Florence made an unsuccessful attempt to reunite the Greek and Roman Catholic churches. It was this council that declared the 7 sacraments to be accepted by the Roman Church. This was promulgated by Eugenius IV in a papal bull in 1439. Thus, the attempt to create a constitutional monarchy in the Roman Church came to an end, and the papacy reverted to the system of papal despotism that it had followed for many centuries. Pius II, in a papal bull entitled Execrapilis issued in 1460, condemned any appeals to future general councils. But the French clergy concurred with the French ruler in the proclamation of the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges in 1438, which made the French Church independent of the Pope, but which in turn put it under the power of the state. The Holy Roman Empire is in trouble. Although the Reforming Council had failed in its attempt to set up constitutional monarchy in the Roman Church, it saved the Church from the disorder of the Great Schism. The lack of success in securing effective reform destroyed the last chance of reform of the Roman Catholic Church from within by mystics. The lack of success in securing effective reform. And you'll start a reform only for it to be short-lived. It is countered. When I was in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, I was pushing for certain reforms. And certain things were happening. But the old, that the political order in churches, even at times you might think that you're gaining, but the old order dies hard, so it can make a resurgence against you. That's what happened to me. And that's what happened here. The old order had not died, because there has never been a system that didn't have its vested interest. Although some people condemn the system, saying it is evil and bad, there are those persons who love it because it serves their purpose well. Hence, when you're reforming, if you're a part of an order, you have to be careful how you reform, because you can lose your life, or you can lose your honor, you can be cast out, you can be overthrown, you can be destroyed. Wow. Do your reflection and email me.